Hello, I'm Dan, and this is Dan Explains. Since people seem to have liked my video on Starship and SLS, I thought I'd like to do another SpaceX Starship video. Why not SLS, also known as the Space Launch System? Well, let's face it, more people would rather watch a video about what not to do at a stoplight than to watch a video about SLS. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. Anyway, so in my video on the Starship and SLS, I mentioned the Starship was made to go to the Moon and Mars. Many people seem to think the Starship is just going to fly there, first the cargo Starship, and then 2 years later, the manned one, similar to Robert Zubrin's Mars Direct plan. Well, there are some serious issues with going to Mars with Starship in almost any configuration. Let me explain why. Let me start off with a quick explanation of what Robert Zubrin's Mars Direct plan is for those who aren't familiar. Robert Zubrin came up with the idea back in the 90s. Basically, the idea is to send an unmanned spacecraft to Mars 2 years ahead of a manned spacecraft. That would give the unmanned spacecraft time to make methane rocket propellant on Mars using the Sabatier process and solar panels. That way the manned spacecraft would not need to carry the propellant needed to make the return journey, saving a lot of weight and money. The propellant would be made on Mars before the manned spacecraft even left Earth. That way they would know for sure that they would have the return propellant. It was a very clever idea, and at the time, in the 90s, it turned the pipe dream of getting to Mars into a possibility. Many people just kind of assume this is how Starship will do it. They even tout that Starship would need less tanker refills to go to Mars than even the Moon, because the propellant for the return journey would be made on Mars. Well, there's a huge issue with that, and that issue is Starship is huge. The Mars Society did an excellent presentation on this, which I've linked in the description. But let me elaborate. The issue, as they point out, is how many solar panels you'd need to make enough propellant for the Starship. You'd either have to wait many years for the propellant to be made, or instead of sending just one Starship 2 years before the crew, you'd have to send many Starships with many solar panels to make up the propellant in time. You can't just wheedle around the problem by carrying more propellant to Mars either, because it's not like it's only going to make 25 or even 50% less propellant than is needed. It's going to fall short by around 90%, assuming the 2-year wait between cargo and manned missions. The Mars Society, which is led by Robert Zubrin, has a proposed solution for this that they call Mars Direct 2.0. Basically, their solution doesn't return the crew with a Starship. Instead, they return them with something called a mini Starship, which, as the name implies, needs way less propellant than a full-size Starship. Well, this idea would work well. It would require SpaceX to design a new spacecraft, which Elon Musk has said they're not going to do. Another issue that people seem to gloss over is, after you make the propellant on Mars, where are you going to store it? The obvious answer is in the propellant tanks of the cargo Starship, right? I mean, they're going to be almost empty after Starship lands, so why not? Well, the issue with that is boil off. Many spacecraft today keep cryogenic propellants cold, not by refrigerating them, but by letting them just slowly boil, cooling it down through evaporation, losing some of the propellant in the process. With the Starship, this isn't going to be a big issue while traveling to Mars, because it's really easy to keep methane fuel cold in space. All they have to do is not paint the Starship with a dark paint. In fact, they may even have to warm the propellant to keep it from freezing. However, that's not an option on Mars, And you can't use boil off to keep it cool because Mars has an atmosphere. Now you might propose just restricting the boil off more. The propellant tanks are pressure vessels after all, right? Well, they aren't good enough pressure vessels, as has already been demonstrated by SpaceX and their cryogenic proof tests. So, that won't work either. Also, insulating the tanks and refrigerating it will divert precious energy away from the propellant making process. Although, that's basically what you have to do whether you like it or not. You can't just make a thicker walled and hence heavier Starship to take the increased tank pressure, because the thing couldn't even get itself into space. So, what the heck do you do about this problem? these problems? Give up? I'm sure many people would agree with that solution, as they think too much money was already wasted on space already that could have been better used elsewhere. But the amount of money that simply goes missing from government social programs every year in the United States could pay for many trips to Mars. So the money spent would make next to no impact if the government was managing it anyway. At any rate, how do we solve this problem? Well, probably the easy solution is to just scrap the whole idea of using solar panels and replace them with a nuclear reactor instead. I know certain groups of people wouldn't like the idea, but it's probably the easiest solution. And people might be surprised NASA is already working on the idea of sending a nuclear reactor to the Moon and Mars in the form of what's called a kilopower reactor. This plan would probably modify the Mars Direct plan by sending a cargo Starship to Mars first with a nuclear reactor on it. That kills two birds with one stone. Not only can you make the propellant faster, it would be able to refrigerate it as well in its own tanks. The manned Starship could either use solar panels, or better yet, travel with another companion cargo Starship that has a nuclear reactor on it, since you probably wouldn't want the reactor to be on your ship in the case something went wrong. What's interesting about that idea, even though it really isn't needed, but it would be nice, is you could tether the two ships together along a cable and spin them to create artificial gravity during the journey. The Starship is actually designed to be lifted by catching arms on Earth, so doing this would be easier than it sounds at first glance. Also, this would keep the companion Starship with the nuclear reactor separated from the crew, reducing the risk if something went wrong with the reactor. Once at Mars, there would be a couple of options. If the crew doesn't mind flying back with artificial gravity, the companion cargo Starship could land to bolster the propellant production on Mars. Or you could load enough propellant onto the companion Starship in low Earth orbit before it leaves for Mars that it can return if you leave it in the orbit around Mars while the astronauts are on the planet. When the astronauts want to return to Earth, they would lift off from Mars after refueling with a cargo Starship that was already on the planet making the propellant, and then meet up the companion cargo Starship in orbit. They would leave Mars orbit and start heading back to Earth before tethering up and spinning, because anything that required the use of the main engines would require the ships to not be tethered and not be in a spin. So, what's your solution to these issues? Also, did you like this video and my other video on rockets? Should I do more videos like this, or just stick to my traditional stuff? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, please press the like button, subscribe to my channel, and ding the bell to get notified when I post new videos. Also, please support me on Patreon, link in the description. The more people who support me, the more time I can dedicate to making videos like this one. So, until next time, have a great week.